Okay, welcome back everyone. This is our second session, which is going to be policy focused with a strong transatlantic flavor. And I just want to hand over to Maria Leis from our partner Breakthrough Energy to introduce this second session.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here and great to see so many familiar and so many new faces. We are hosting the second session, so welcome everyone. We are focusing on transatlantic aspects of scaling up carbon removal activities. My name is Maria Leis, I work for Breakthrough Energy Europe and I'm based here in Brussels. First of all, I want to thank the team of the Negative Emissions Platform, in specific Chris and Alina, for hosting this summit today. In a short time, you pulled together an impressive program, and it's great to have the whole, or a big part of the CDR community here in Brussels at the heart of European policy making. I'm pleased to welcome distinguished speakers from both sides of the Atlantic today here at the session. We won't have much time, so let's dive right into it. We will start with a little keynote by my very colleague, Jack ANDREASEN. Jack is Carbon Management Manager at Breakthrough Energy based in Washington, D.C. And I'm particularly pleased that he is here today because 95% of what I know about CDR I learned from Jack. So yeah, he will kick us off with an overview of what is going on CDR in the US, as well as sharing his views on the CDR landscape in Europe. Jack, it's great to have you, and the stage is yours.
All right, I've been standing all week, so I'm going to sit down for this one. And thank you, Maria. Thank you, NEP, for having us here. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. So yeah, I'm Jack ANDREASEN. I work for Breakthrough Energy. We're looking to accelerate the climate to a net zero goal by 2050. We do this and we think about it in the context of what we call the 5 grand challenges. So the major sort of emitting sectors: electricity, transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and buildings. Obviously, there's crossover with all of these, but these we kind of group. We do this by using a sort of innovation pipeline from project ideation to putting steel in the ground. We do this through 3 vehicles that we have within our organization. The first is called the Breakthrough Fellows Program. This is an incubator accelerator style organization. We then have a traditional venture capital team, and we have a team called Breakthrough Catalyst, which is project level financing for first of a kind and pilot projects on things like direct air capture. They just issued, I believe it was a $50 million grant to Xcel Energy, which is a utility in the United States, to purchase long-duration energy storage batteries from Form Energy. So it's an example of how that money has gone out and getting these otherwise projects that have a missing piece of the capital stack in the ground. But like I said, they do things like DAC too, and that sort of brings me here to Europe. I was in Zurich yesterday with at the Climeworks conference, and it was great to see not just the first commercial facility, but it was great to see the European contingent of CDR. Given that, after the Inflation Reduction Act and Investment Act, most of DAC deployments are looking at the United States right now due to the generous policy benefits. However, DAC has its foothold in Europe with the Climeworks headquarters, project in Iceland, the newly announced sort of Norwegian potential 45Q policy, as well as pilot projects in Norway done by Remover. The Europeans are leading on the sort of regulatory side of things. The certification of removals into the EU system, EU ETS system, is going to be vital. We were speaking today about how whether it's in the European ETS or whether it's direct to government procurement, what governments decide are the regulations around what is a durable carbon dioxide removal is going to be a signal to the voluntary and compliance markets on what they should be, what companies should be purchasing. So what makes it into this, and maybe more importantly, what makes it out of this, will be defining CDR going forward. On the United States, for those who are maybe not as familiar with some of the policy we've recently passed, the flagship is a $3.5 billion DAC hubs program. This is for 4 regional DAC hubs across the United States, with intention of, by the time they're installed, doing 1 million tons a year at each of them. Multiple companies can participate in these hubs. It's an incredible program. and will define DAC in the United States for decades to come. We also passed amendments to 45Q, which is a tax credit that pays companies, whether CCS or DAC, to store carbon dioxide permanently, and DAC receives $180 a ton for each ton of CO2 that they store. Fundamentally, what we're doing in the United States is driving down the green premium associated with DAC. So the cost of DAC right now is very high. It needs revenue, it needs offtake, and the difference between what a company could do to reduce their emissions and the cost of DAC, we think of this, right, as the sort of green premium. And so DAC in that way represents a price ceiling on a net zero plan. It's going to always be, because of thermodynamics, the most expensive way to get rid of CO2. But then looking forward, we have a point in time now where we can look at the next generation of CDR policies. And in the United States, we're thinking about DAC at the moment has received disproportionate amounts, basically all of the policy support at the federal level. We need to think, yes, DAC and other durable forms of CDR. There's a number of different pathways, many of them mentioned already today: bio-oil, biomass, enhanced rock weathering, ocean alkalinity. You can go down the list. There are other durable ways to store CDR, and we should be incentivizing those. And what does that actually look like? Well, these are policies for research and development. The United States government put out $25 million for MRV research that is being done by the national labs. This looks like funding for first-of-a-kind projects and pilots in each one of these sort of technologies to understand the technical difficulties and work through those to not just drive down the costs, but increase the viability and the durability of each one of these technologies. And then fundamentally, government procurement. At the end of the day, when you look at avoiding the worst outcomes of climate change and the rise in global temperatures, the tons that we will need to remove, whether that's 0 or 10% of the total sort of net zero stack, that tonnage and the dollar amount associated with that tonnage really can only be handled at the level of federal government. They have the purse and capacity to remove and pay for it. And with government procurement in the United States, there was recently reintroduced what is called the CREST Act. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation that was introduced in both the House and the Senate, so Republicans and Democrats both getting behind it. That would do just that. It sets research dollars aside for every CDR technology, as well as a pilot procurement program associated with it. No strict dollar amount attached to it right now, but it would allow the United States for the first time to purchase CO2, fundamentally uniquely for a climate scenario. But there's other things we need. Compliance and voluntary markets will need to get better. We have the low carbon fuel standard in the United States, which direct air capture is able to opt into. We have the removal certification so that removals could play a role in the European ETS. And we need to be able to make credible claims. Every time I get to a CDR conference, I am kind of amazed that it gets repeated on stage every time, and yet we're still talking about it. You need to be able to say you removed a ton of carbon, or however much you removed. You need to be able to show exactly where it is, and you need to be able to account for it over the lifetime of the project within a certain degree of credibility. Without that, you don't have CDR, you don't have a market, and fundamentally, you don't have emissions removals at all. Finally, things that sort of get talked about a little less is the human capital necessary. There's a ton of folks getting into CDR right now, which is great, but we need more. And we don't just need policy folks, as much as I love you all. We need people to actually put steel in the ground. We need workers. We need university programs to start offering CDR as a concentration or even a major. We need engineering programs to start pushing folks into engineering that is related to CDR technologies. This has to be a whole of society approach to scale this, and fundamentally that's going to take a lot of people. The sort of piece that we all talk around today and every conversation I had has dealt with finance, and being able to pay for these and cash flowing through these systems is important for them to grow. And without it, it's just not going to work. And the reason why finance has been slow to this is because it's risky. These technologies have to be de-risked at the project level, and traditional forms of finance will follow once they see that there's going to be a return on their investment. And you can see this happening. JP Morgan Chase just had an incredibly large purchase. Microsoft purchased from Ørsted. And so this sort of like voluntary and compliance markets, I think, are interesting because they are truly the place, voluntary in particular, where transatlantic partnerships are possible and are happening right now. That is the voluntary market is where the Transatlantic Partnership is currently taking place. We can scale CDR. We're going to need to. We need supportive policy, supportive regulatory structures to make sure that carbon is removed and stays removed. These are, we need guardrails to make sure financial institutions see the value in it and can put money for it. And as mentioned, we need a workforce to be able to do it in the US, in Europe, and around the world. We can remove carbon, we will, and most importantly, because we must. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Jack, for this great overview. I think that's a very good start for us to really dive into a discussion. And I'm very happy to welcome the speakers on stage. We have here in the room Noah Dyke, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Carbon Management, US Department of Energy, FABIEN Ramos, Carbon Removal Policy Officer at the European Commission, and Ingrid Sudvor, co-founder and director of the NGO Carbon Balance Initiative. Welcome. And on top of that, we have two speakers joining us online. I hope that they are already live. We have TAMME, Managing Director, Climate Principles, a Climate Policy Advisory, as well as FLORIAN, SCHABUS, investor at Planet A, a European climate tech fund. I see Eve, and I'm sure Florian is with us as well. Perfect. Now I can see you both. First of all, thank you for joining us today. I think it's a great panel. It's very diverse, from interesting background, and most importantly, transatlantic. I didn't introduce your organizations in much detail, so if you want to give more background, also about your previous life, so please do it while you speak. We will get started with the European perspective. So we already heard Jack telling us what is happening in the US, a lot of focus on subsidies and on getting projects off the ground. So let's start by looking what is actually happening in Europe, because here it's happening a lot as well. So at the end of last year, the European Commission proposed the carbon removal certification framework, which is designed to ensure carbon removal projects are verified, safe, and transparent. And FABIEN, you have been working very closely on this proposal, and it's great to have you here. I will ask all of you to be brief in your introductory statements, so please speak around 3 minutes maximum. And I would like to ask you to kick us off by explaining how the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, CRCF, will shape future carbon markets in Europe and beyond, also in countries like the US, and what else is needed to scale CDR in Europe. Thank you, Fabienne.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, so I'm Fabien Ramos. I'm working at the European Commission, and specifically on carbon removal. The carbon removal certification framework is something that probably many of you already know, but very briefly, we see it as our tool for the integration of carbon removal, the future integration of carbon removal in the European policy. Because we know it, Europe needs carbon removal to be climate neutral, and being climate neutral is our ambition. And to integrate this carbon removal in our policy framework, we need to be sure about the quality of this carbon removal. Is it correctly quantified? Is it stored for the long term? What are the sustainability aspects? Are they respected? And all these kind of things. And in Europe, we know that we have a tendency to regulate things, and we think that to be really sure about the quality of this carbon removal, we needed a standard, a common standard across Europe, that all member states in Europe, all countries in Europe can agree on what should be a good quality of carbon removal. And when we have that, we can look at the specific policies to integrate this carbon removal. Some options have been mentioned, and this is going to be the next step. What kind of market, what kind of carbon removal market we can create? We might start in a kind of pilot phase to look at the voluntary carbon market options, but very quickly, if we want to reach the level of carbon removal that we need for the climate neutrality, and in Europe we are talking about 100 million tons of carbon that needs to be removed from the atmosphere, then the voluntary carbon market alone, let's be clear, will not be sufficient. and we need to integrate that in our policy. Jack mentioned the ETS, of course. There is a possibility with the ETS. So should we look at carbon removal in a separated way? So to look at carbon removal on one side, ETS emissions reductions on the other side? Should we merge both? Should we do a link but controlled by a kind of entity in between, etc.? This is a kind of option that we'll look at that. And once the certification framework will be in place, we'll have once again the tool to do that correctly.
Thank you very much, Fabienne. And yeah, you mentioned the ETS with the, end goal to monetize it basically. And that brings me to the US, where money played a big role in the incentive schemes that had been set up. Jack already gave an overview of the policies that have been implemented. And Noah, you were very involved in many of the programs. I now want to look at the international dimension of this and would like to ask you, based on your experience, how do you envision the international cooperation on scaling up carbon removals, and what role the Transatlantic cooperation, so everyone that is present here in this room, can actually play?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. And I promise we didn't plan it this way, but what we're doing in the US is basically everything but making a standard for carbon removal purchases. So stepping back, there's really three big buckets of what we're working on. One is the science and innovation funding. We have big programs for R&D, we have funding for pilots, small and large, and I think notably the direct air capture hubs is a multi-billion-dollar investment to get commercial scale CDR projects off the ground, large commercial scale. In addition, we have a suite of tax credits to incentivize various types of carbon removal, and we're launching a CDR purchasing pilot, which is the third pillar of what we're doing. In addition to that purchasing pilot, we have things around a standard. We're working on guidance for best practices in doing life cycle carbon accounting. We're supporting tools and research and frameworks for measurement, reporting, and verification. What we're not doing is saying, here's a standard for CDR. And so that's where I think we have this opportunity for collaboration, because we need all of that to have this comprehensive carbon removal industry of the future take off. And so figuring out how we can work together to leverage what is possible in the US and what is possible in the European context, I think is really important, because I recognize that we can't come to the EU and say, hey, why don't you also have a $3.5 billion grant program for carbon removal solutions, even if we know that the $3.5 billion that we have is a good start, but we needed way more funding in way more geographies, right? So I think figuring out how we can take the strengths of what's happening on either side of the Atlantic is exactly where we want to end up.
Yes, thank you so much, Noah. And yes, as you said, that's why we are here. So please be bold, present your best ideas, and then we will, try to follow up on them. And now I would like to invite Florian SCHABUS, who is joining us online, to actually explain us a bit from the investor's perspective, because that's what we need. We need investments in CDR, also private investments. In the end, the state is a leverager, but we also need private investments. What, based on your experience, when screening a CDR company or a climate tech company more broadly, what you take into consideration, and what kind of instruments and support mechanisms are actually helping to make the space more attractive? Thank you, Florian.
Yeah, hi everyone, great to be here, and I hope the internet connection works. I'm with a climate tech fund called Planet A. We're based out of Germany, and we do early stage investments in impactful sustainability technologies, very much across the board, looking at all sectors and industries with a particular focus on hard to abate sectors, because that's where we think, both from a commercial perspective, but also from an impact perspective, there's a lot to be done. So that's why also CDR is a really interesting space for us, because if you think about it, it's basically an entirely new industry that we somehow have to get off the ground to reach our climate goals. So there's lots and lots of opportunities, and there's been quite some venture capital activity happening, in particular in direct air capture. So when we look at these companies, we obviously have to take into account kind of like what we as venture capital investors look for in terms of impact, but also the growth perspective of a company. And then I'd say there's kind of like two major considerations. The one is that a lot of the technologies we need for CDR are, very CapEx intensive. It's hardware that we need, right? We can't fix our problems with software only. So there's a certain technology scale up aspect that we have to look into. And the second one is really the market side of things, which I think is a fundamental aspect for us, which is a big difference between CDR companies and other sectors that we look into that might work in energy efficiency, etc. Because there is factually no deep market for high quality CDR as of now. Of course, there is advanced market commitments and there's companies stepping up, but we're really far away from a functioning market, which in our view is really vital for the future success of carbon removal. And if I look at the market bit, there's as Jack already mentioned, regulation plays a big role. I mean, we need certification, we need other let's say elements of a functioning market, but I think by far the biggest lever in terms of policy that we see is really stimulating demand, both from a voluntary side, but also from a public side, whether it's public procurement or ETS or other forms of offtake. I think that's critical. And then on the other aspect, really catalytic capital to help those technologies at the early stages get out of the lab and de-risk to a stage where they are relevant for us as private investors. So yeah, there's a lot to be done, but we're very, very excited to play a role in that and hope to scale up the CDR industry in Europe as well.
Thank you very much, Florian. And I will now turn to Ingrid, who is based in Norway. And Florian actually just mentioned mechanisms that could work, including incentive mechanisms. There are some early talks in Norway also about incentive mechanisms, actually. So I would like to ask you if you could actually tell us a little bit more about what is going on in Norway and what other countries can also learn from the government's approach there.
Yeah. First, I'm representing Carbon Balance Initiative here today, and we're an NGO initiative coming out of University of Oxford and Oxford Net Zero, where I'm also an associate. And one of the core things we work on is the durable net zero state or definition of net zero, which Mark and Eli highlighted in the introduction speech. And I think that's one of the key takeaways I hope everyone brings out of today, is that this is actually what is needed for stabilization of temperatures. But we also work on policy mechanisms for getting to durable net zero. And one of the countries we look at is Norway, where I'm also from. And I have to, disclaimer, I'm not a wide government. I don't know every policy that the Norwegian government is doing in comparison to Noah, who runs this. But I have contacts in the government and the environmental agency. And I think one thing I'm going to comment on is obviously this reverse tax discussion. But first, I think one of the reasons why Norway is, I guess, often stated as a front runner is, I think, because we were quite early first movers. So we did a lot of R&D funding similar to the US. We have programs with innovation funds. Remover, the Norwegian DAC company, got received 36 million recently as well. So Norway has been very early on the storage, transportation, and also the R&D for certain of these technologies. And I think that's one of the reasons we're called a front runner on carbon management. The second is obviously this policy instrument debate right now that's happening. So we currently in Norway have no policy instrument that incentivizes CDR at the level that the US has. There is two elements that's being discussed right now. One is the short term, and one is the more long-term framework. And the short-term is the reverse tax that is, I've heard lots of people are interested in. And what I can say is that this is the government's commissioned or asked the environmental agency to look into short-term incentivization policies for bio-CCS and for DAC. One of the highlighted policies that came out of that was the reverse tax of 2,000 kroners per ton, which is equivalent of, I think, around 170 euros, so and so. And it's then proposed for a 10-year period. And what I really want to highlight after talking to some contacts I have is this is not a government proposal. The government has not actively commented on the reverse tax, but it is being reviewed, and we do, obviously, from the CDR community, hope that this is seriously being reviewed. And what I can say is I've asked for timelines, and I think what we can expect is that there will be a comment on this around October, when the state budget or the national budgets will come out, and the governments usually then comment on individual policy suggestions. So I'm going to wrap up by what can other countries learn, and I think when I scribbled down in my book this morning, what can we actually learn from Norway? I think there's two things, and one of them is not being afraid to be the first movers and taking risk as a state, as a government, in giving the first subsidies or first supports or grants to do R&D. We all know that governments has a special role to play here, and I think Norway has done this for a while. And then I think the second thing is something close to heart in my work with Durable Net Zero, is that we need to recognize the sort of full chain CDR with a huge then focus also on the transport and storage development and infrastructure. And I think Norway has been good, and they're probably doing this because we're a fossil fuel producing country that is now developing CCS and CDR and recognizing that they need that for their transitioning plan. And I think we need to start that debate at a wider level. So that's it.
Yes, thank you very much, Ingrid. And yeah, we have heard now from different perspectives. We have just heard from a country, Norway. We already listened to the European perspective. And this brings me to Eve. Eve, in your career, you have worked and advised different levels of government and governance, national, European, as well as international. So I would like to ask you, how do national policies and incentive mechanisms play together with the European level, yet to mention the global level like UNFCCC?
Thank you, Maria, and very happy to join you today. Sorry to be on the screen. Every now and then we get the glimpse of the audience, so it's so nice to see familiar faces, or some people I even recognize, you know, from like their hair from behind. So it's great. So the challenge in answering this question when we talk about the national and EU level policies and international policies on removals is that it is still somewhat theoretical, given that removal policies and incentive mechanisms are still emerging. If you look at the traditional removals in the LULUCF sector, then this is clearly something that hasn't been a success story so far, because that sink in EU has been decreasing, not increasing. So whatever policy tools we will put in place for now the broader range of removals, we need to do a lot better than what we have done so far. So broadly speaking, in the ideal world, we would have the Paris Agreement's 1.5-degree target that then trickles down to EU targets, and then those trickle down to country targets, plus then the ETS that delivers parts of this. And then all of this adds up when you go back up from the countries to EU to the Paris Agreement. The reality is more complex because in the case of the EU, we might be adding up to our contribution to the Paris Agreement, but globally, the country's targets, climate targets, don't add up to what we need. They fall way short of the target. And that gap is there also for removals, given that the existing natural removals cannot be scaled to the extent needed, and tech removals will be obviously then increasingly needed. But then again, if you look at Europe, the interesting thing is that countries can and do go beyond what is required in EU policies or targets or incentives or actions, because what EU puts in place is kind of the basis, the lowest common denominator, and countries can do more and go beyond it. And if you look at the climate targets, then several countries have taken on more ambitious targets. But when we look at removals, we're just not yet living in a world where removal targets are a ubiquitous part of a climate policy. So still theoretical. I think it's super, super important to map out all the policy tools and incentives as they are being prepared and announced. That also includes funding streams, and we need to make this accessible. So we have already a laudable initiative by Carbon Gap with their carbon removal policy tracker, but that is still early days. I mean, there could be a lot more information added to it over time, which would help also removal project developers to understand what incentives are available, what kind of support is available, and how they can apply for it. So both on EU level and on the member state level. So to kind of draw things together, we are definitely still in early days. Obviously, everything starts with being able to quantify removals, so hence the carbon removal certification framework that FABIEN was talking about is very important. I see that the 2040 target discussions will definitely add urgency on building and revising incentive mechanisms, for example, thinking of the Innovation Fund. And this process should also give ideas how to combine different incentives across national and European level for removals. Thanks.
We heard from Florian, for example, that incentive mechanisms are important. They really speak to the business community. And what I can say from a European perspective, at least, it's the predictability and simplicity, also compared to some of the programs that we have here, that speaks to the business community. And I would like to ask you what other countries can learn from it, and not simply like just putting subsidies, but what are actually learnings that you generated along the ways when implementing these programs. So what did you, what do you want to share from the first projects that you were able to implement?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what is a really important shift that has happened in the United States is that instead of thinking about this exclusively as a long-term market context, what we've done is we've pulled that back and said, if we ever want to get to a market in the US that could be linked more globally, we need to innovate now. And so we've shifted our thinking to frame how can we drive innovation. We're not trying to hit specific ton removed goals. What we're trying to do is hit specific innovation goals that will enable us to set and then achieve those broader deployment goals in the future. And so I think once we start to shift how we think and think both in the long term about ultimate scale and markets, and in the short term, how do we actually drive innovation, we start to understand the needs of the project developers, the innovators today. And it really is about building as small a unit as we can to de-risk, and then building as small the next size as we can, and moving forward to actually help meet innovators where they are and project developers where they are. And it's often very challenging to get integrated into a big market that has high barriers to entry. And so what we've tried to do is provide the grant and subsidy support in a way that is usable, is bankable, that investors are able to grasp, thinking about how we can work with companies to really implement, and through that deployment-led innovation, enable us to get to where we need to go in the long term. And hopefully we get to a similar type of outcome, but it enables us to meet the field where it is and help accelerate it as quickly as we can.
Thank you. And if I may ask, how are you able to actually find the most innovative projects that are at the same time able to scale?
I mean, that's a billion-dollar question, right? I think the first lesson that we've learned is that we have the humility to know that we don't know the answer to that question. And so it's making sure that we are supporting a diversity of carbon removal pathways, a diversity of companies within those pathways, and making sure we're not locking in any one technology. Makes it hard when our funding says you have to do direct air capture, it has to be really big, but we recognize that we can support all of the solutions and are working to make sure that we're supporting a basket of technologies. The mutual fund instead of stock picking, because I think it's just too hard to predict what that's going to be. And so on one hand, it's simply doing the innovation work is what matters. And as long as you're starting on that path, picking the winners and losers from that is something that I think the market will ultimately figure out if we give the support of a broad basket of solutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Noah. Fabienne, I will give the chance to you to answer to that, and maybe also highlighting to turn the question around basically. So what can the US and other countries actually learn from the European approach? And I would also be very interested to learn how you are making sure that innovation plays a role in the mechanisms that you are building up, the CRCF, but we also know that the Innovation Fund is an important funding instrument that you actually have at hand.
Absolutely. The Innovation Fund is extremely important, and I will say a few words about that. But first, to the first part of your question, what can be learned from the experience on Europe? Difficult for me to tell you exactly what US or such country can learn from Europe. And certainly I will not say what Europe should teach to this country. But what I can say is that we are, it has been said, at a very interesting time. The new era of carbon removal is coming. We are at the very beginning. And we have to test different approach, and also approach that are a bit specific for the different regions of the world, because our economy are not functioning exactly the same way. I was mentioning that in Europe we have a tendency for regulation. This is true, and there is some reason for that. Also, for this carbon certification framework, one maybe, and tell me if I'm wrong, a small difference that we see is that I have the feeling that US, and there is very good reason for that, put a bit of focus on direct air capture, for instance. While in Europe, we would like to try to keep as long as possible this portfolio approach. And if you want to have a portfolio approach of different type of carbon removal solution, you need to be able to compare them when you want to fund carbon removal solutions. And the certification scheme that we want to put in place for carbon removal will help for that, because we will have the methodology for quantifying different type of carbon removal solutions that will help to compare what can be achieved with these different solutions. So now to come back on the Innovation Fund. Yes, the Innovation Fund is an interesting source of funding, of course, for projects. We launched a 1 billion call 2 years ago. Last year, it was a 2 billion call. This year will come with a 3 billion funding through this Innovation Fund. And it's open to all the technologies that we need for the future, including carbon management and including carbon removal. So this is true that for now, on the ones very specific on carbon removal, we don't have so many. We have some. We have a lot of carbon management in general. We have a lot of CCUS projects. On the 3 billion fund that we have granted up to now, 1.8 billion were for solutions for projects with at least a part of carbon capture, transport, or storage or use. So it's significant, and we cannot say that we don't do anything. But yes, for carbon removal, we are looking at the different options. One, we will have the certification in place. It will be much easier for us also to look at the possibility for auctioning or for a contract for difference or other element that could be used, because we will have the tool to assess the quality of what is proposed. And also it's very important, because if we are unlucky and it doesn't go very well for some project, the civil society that sometimes has still a little bit of doubt on carbon removal could be very unhappy about that, and we would like to avoid this situation. So, and last point I would like to say, and it has been also raised, Europe is something what we can find in Europe at the level of the European Union itself, but of course in Europe there is also member state, and we need to find complementarity between what could come from the budget of the European Union and what could come from the budget of the member state. We had good examples in Denmark, in Sweden, where we try to put in place projects with this type of complementarity. We are working also a lot with Norway, and to use the infrastructures that are developed in Norway to make projects where CO2 is captured in Europe to be stored. So I think all that is also very important.
Thank you very much, Fabienne. And you are raising the point about civil society and how important acceptance is. And this turns me to you, Ingrid. What do you think? How can we make sure to create public acceptance that is needed to actually scale up CDR projects?
Yeah, I thought about this project and then, or this question, and I'm thinking, so obviously I'm going to talk from what we focus on in carbon balance. And I'm actually going to use a little bit of a story now because I'm coming from Bonn today. I'm going back to Bonn to the UN Climate Conference. And I want to highlight, the first thing I want to highlight that I think is a responsibility in this room is that there is a very big polarization right now around the need for technological removals. And this is very apparent in the hallways of Bonn, and it's worrying because, as Mark and Eli said in their opening note, this is unavoidable. We need CDR. That also means nature-based solutions, and it means technological removals. So I think there's a real responsibility, both for technology developers, financiers, governments, and also civil society and academia to really try to break through this false information or polarization that's happening right now. And I urge us to brainstorm this together. The second thing, I think a way to solve this that we are experimenting with in carbon balance is that one of the big critiques from civil society is the risk of locking in infrastructure, of locking in huge and a lot of investments that we might not need removals or storage to the degree that we're planning. And what we are trying to do right now in carbon balance in our University of Oxford is linking the production of CO2 to the need of storage and removals. And this is one of the things that I would encourage as a narrative to also tell civil society we can actually control for this lock-in risk. That's one of the biggest critiques. And then I guess the one final thing that I would like to highlight is this learning from other industries and learning from other experiences. And I know in Norway, one of the biggest critiques of big infrastructural projects or innovation has also been when we do wind parks and we're not really engaging with the community or local communities there. And the local communities are also not benefiting from the development of these projects. So I also do think that one of the things of how we really make public acceptance wide is also to summarize, make them understand that it's unavoidable. Try to link the production of CO2 to the need of storage and removals. And finally, include them in the decisions and in the benefits of actually deploying CDR widely.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. And I think it was an excellent point that you made, comparing it to the wind industry and how to actually, engage with local communities. I want to kind of link two questions. So we have talked about what can drive innovation and what can we learn from other industries. And I want to ask Florian, who's joining us online, what can we learn from other industries? How can we drive innovation in CDR?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question and one that we think about a lot. But I think on a very high level, like, CDR is very different from other industries in the sense that it doesn't solve an immediate consumer or company problem, right? It's more of a public goods problem, which is a bit of a difference to energy production, for instance. But the way we think about it is really in terms of problems, right? And then I guess there's for us two different ways. It's either about how can you create a problem where CDR is the solution, or how can you actually solve problems with CDR? And when it's about the first point, if you look at other public goods problems like waste management, right, and stuff like this, it's really the role of government is very important. And I think the more pressure there is to decarbonize and the more stakeholder pressure there is to move to high quality removals, the easier it is going to be to scale up the industry. And like with any other disruptive technology, I mean, you mentioned wind or solar, right? The government really plays a big role in the initial scale up, right? I think we wouldn't be here in renewables if there weren't feed-in tariffs and other government support. So, you know, the scale-up question is really something where government plays a big role, I guess, where there's lots of learnings from other industry. But that doesn't solve necessarily the market question, which is really creating demand and offtake for that. And that I think if you put that in place, then also the scale up will follow. So I think it's a bit the other way around. And then the other point is about how can you solve problems with CDR? And I think there we see quite some innovation happening of thinking, okay, how can you actually you know, create co-benefits with CDR that actually deliver value to companies, for instance, right? If you think about biochar in the agriculture space, if you think about injecting CO2 into cement, where there's actually real cost saving and in a sense a business rationale for companies to remove CO2. So I think there's a lot of business model innovation that can happen, and I think there we really see a lot of interesting ideas popping up on a regular basis. I'd also quickly like to touch upon one point that Noah mentioned around this portfolio approach. I think that's also something that we see that is really, really critical, right? In the end, we don't have a crystal ball and knowing which technology is going to be successful in the end, right? But it's about really getting a lot of technologies into the race and then seeing which ones are going to be you know, deployed at scale and deliver the carbon removal that we need. And for certain types of technologies, we as venture capitalists might be the right funding mechanism, but for other types of technologies, we might not be, right? So I think there also has to be a wider discussion happening of what other types of capital do you need to scale up other types of carbon removal, which might not fit the risk profile or the investment focus of venture capital firms.
Thank you very much, Florian. So we heard about different things that actually have to come together to scale up CDR. I also want to ask you the question, Yves, how can we actually encourage and support innovation across the entire CDR value chain, also including transport and storage for CDR? What do you think are the most important points that we can implement and focus on in the next months?
Thanks, Maria. Well, when we talk about innovation, we need to have a built-in openness for new solutions. The challenge, as Florian just mentioned, was CDR is such a wide range of different things. And if we talk about incentivizing or supporting innovation across the entire value chain, then that's can look quite different across different CDR methods. So one thing is, of course, the innovation funding itself. So we have Horizon Europe, we have a member state level funding for that. But then also there has to be, because if you talk about the transport of CO2 and the storage of CO2, in Europe, that is, there is a lot of cross-border collaboration that needs to happen for it, and also in that setting, like we need to be ready to learn about new ways how to improve things, and honestly, like the same point I made before on the information being made available and easily available for those who are seeking it, it also applies to innovation funding for different types of CDR projects. And this is actually the case for, it's not a carbon removal specific issue, it's also not a CCS specific issue, but I just keep hearing from different communities that it's so difficult to understand where is support available and how to tap into it. And we as a community, I think, should try to work to make it easier to find and use.
So it's not only about innovation in technology space, but also innovation in the way we should work together and share information. And I think that's a very, very important point. Not only here in Europe, but that's actually also we can do transatlantic. So that's It's appreciated. We have a few more minutes to actually allow some questions for the audience. So I would like to ask all of you, if you have questions or comments, please make sure to shortly introduce yourself if you speak. Thank you. Do we have an extra microphone?
Thank you, Noah. Hi, I'm Paulo from CarbonX. And the question I have is more for Fabian, and it's or Fabien. The question is, before we settle down on a specific standard for the EU CRCF, could we envisage a sort of a preliminary endorsement mechanism for certain specific CDRs? That would help greatly with demand. Could that be envisaged? And that's maybe a bit of a naive question, but.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think so. I would make a difference between there's two different aspects in this question. What we are working on, and this certification of carbon removal, is really the tool, as I said in the introduction, that will allow us to fully integrate in the future, not now. Our 2030 objectives are clearly without carbon removal, but in a post-2030 world. And to do that, we know that we need to do it immediately. So to have this tool for the integration of carbon removal. But it's not that we are not looking today at carbon removal solutions, and we are not supporting carbon removal. I think Eve mentioned Horizon Europe. We are also, we have a quite significant budget on the research on carbon removal. Carbon removal, we talk a lot about engineering solution. It's also about carbon farming for us. There might be some discussion on that, but for us it's something important. And we have different funding. In Europe, we have a fund that is called the LIFE program that is giving money for pilot projects that are doing this type of natural-based solutions for carbon removal. Denmark recently announced a project to store carbon from biomass or waste and other type of biomass in Norway, and this is without the certification scheme already in place. So it's not because we are putting in place this scheme for the future that today projects are not or cannot already happen.
It's not so much about whether or not you're supporting or not. It's about endorsing it and say, this could be future compliant. That's more the question.
So your question is, if we can say today this type of project, you can be sure that the certification scheme, for carbon removal that we are currently discussing under negotiation will accept them. I think there is some indication when you look at the proposal, when we look at the different discussion with the Council and the Parliament. But of course, as long as we don't have the final text signed, we cannot say and that this type of project for sure will be fully in the scope of this. We have to wait for the end of the negotiation between the European Parliament, between the member state, and also we are doing a lot of work with experts in the context of the expert group on carbon removal to define the methodology. And this is a very transparent work stream. The discussion are web streamed online, and we invite you to follow that. So from this discussion, you can get a very good idea if this type of project will fall into the scope of the carbon removal or not, but we cannot endorse officially anything at this stage.
Thank you, Fabienne. We don't have an extra microphone, but we will make it work. I see there's a hand over there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Reinemann from Bioenergy Europe, and the question that I had is that when we look at the Renewable Energy Directive, there you have a greenhouse gas savings requirement for bioenergy, and we're talking about that here as well for CDR, that you need to consider the life cycle assessment and the perspectives of what kind of emissions do you have embedded in the process and how that happens. But we don't have any similar discussion for fossil fuels, so we don't really have a full understanding of what they're being compared to. So how important do you think it is that we kind of have this life cycle accounting happening in other sectors so that we have a better understanding of what kind of baseline cases? Because I think it's good that we're going through and making sure that we are ensuring that we are achieving net impacts and net benefits, but just comparing that to how other sectors, especially in fossil fuels, don't have that kind of level of commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. I would encourage to select a few questions, then we answer to all of them. So are there any more questions in the room? There's one over here. And may I ask to change the screen so that we can see Eva and Florian as well?
Amazing, thank you. Marta Kropinska, CEO and co-founder of Curate. My question is also related to driving demand. Most of our business is in the UK. The UK is the first country to have the legal definition of net zero, which is reduce 90% and then remove the rest. What that often means is that many would think that they have to first reduce by 90% before they start thinking about removals. And we were thinking about this concept of twin targets, where even if you have a 2030 or a 2040 net zero goal, you have to be proving that you're on a pathway rather than being able to delay it until, the year prior to your net zero target. So I suppose my question is, what are your views on introducing twin targets? And do you believe, as we do, that it would be an important step to drive more demand? And I think in our view, it's still a more demand than a supply constrained industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more and then we will make a round. I see one question back there.
Hi, my name is Steffen Engling. I work in the office of Timo Wölken, who is the shadow rapporteur on the carbon removal certification framework. I think Florian said a very interesting thing there, that for some of the activities, venture capitalists might be the right funding solutions, but for others they might be not. We tend to agree with that. And I just wanted to ask if the understanding is the same, that because of the impacts on biodiversity and other sustainability criteria for the investors as well, and also the problematics of carbon accounting and land-based and nature-based solutions, the technological solutions, so direct air capture, CCS, are more the ones that investors are going after, and that for the land-based solutions we need a different kind of funding framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we answer these questions, and I would maybe start with Florian. We had the last question directed mostly to you. So, I mean, feel free to answer that one, but also touch upon the others if you want. So the stage is yours.
I think it's a very, very good point. I think you've also mentioned that a bit before. Overall, if you look at climate technologies across the board, like the funding stack is very, very different to what venture capitalists are used to, right? So even investing in technological CDR solutions is a bit of a stretch for everyone, because venture capitalists are not used to funding CapEx intensive hardware businesses, right? Different timescales, different funding requirements, etc. But to answer your question, I think the reason why we think technological CDR is a bit more of a venture-friendly asset class in a sense is really the kind of growth expectations we have, right? I think what we can do is support early stage technologies where we really see this kind of like scalable business model potentially, right? By being a technology provider and licensing the technology or scaling rapidly that we require for our return expectations, which in the nature-based side of things you probably don't have, because it's more about project development and then more steady cash flow, right? So you don't have this technology component which enable business models that we like to see. And there, other types of capital providers have to move in. I think even on the technological side, right? I think what we can do is support companies from, let's say, first lab scale prototype to, okay, how do we bridge this gap to industrial deployment? After that, it's also more of an infrastructure game, if you think about it. So I think that's probably the role that venture capitalists could play. And then I think if you think about the market more holistically, there's certain intermediary functions, whether that's on the MRV side, whether that's on ratings or other ways of ensuring integrity quality, where venture capitalists can play a role because of that strong technology component. And yeah, on the other points, I think the life cycle question is a good one, and I think that's something where we as an investor community have to become stronger as well. So at Planet A, we have been actually the first European fund to have an in-house life cycle assessment team, and we do perform those for every investment that we do to really be sure about and quantify the impact of our investment targets. But I think that's still something that from an investor perspective, we see that has to be much more widespread to really avoid investing in solutions which just from an impact perspective don't make sense. I hope this somewhat answers the question.
Thank you very much, Florian. Eva, I saw you nodding when the second question was asked about targets driving demand. Do you want to comment on that one or on any of the other two questions?
Yeah, happy to. This is the one that I kind of marked down for myself. I do like the new vocabulary that has emerged, twin targets. Before we used to talk about separate targets, but this is definitely more catchy, and I understand essentially it would mean the same. I mean, the question from Curate was more focusing on corporate action, but I mean, the same concept of having separate targets applies, you know, for corporates or for countries or, you know, regions, whoever wants to take on climate targets. And I agree that currently we have more of a demand issue. But I think this is an area where also VCMI could show a bit more guidance. The challenge is that their beyond valuation mitigation guidance comes out in September, but that is not necessarily exactly what you're looking for, and they're more in-depth like revision of the standards where they are supposed to look at different residual emissions for different sectors and what is expected by companies. That only comes out by COP29, so that's a year and a half away. But the fact that it's a year and a half away, I think there is time to engage with them and ask for this kind of guidance, so that indeed companies would need to show continuously that they are on the path of actually having the removals that they need by the time they need, and that they get started sooner rather than later, right?
Thank you very much. Anyone here on stage who wants to comment on the three questions that have been posed?
So I can just say that from our perspective, what matters is not necessarily that there are twin targets, but that the money gets out the door. So we know that we have a shared target of billion ton per year scale carbon removal within a few decades. If we start in a few decades, we are not going to have the amount of carbon removal that we need. So we need to start now. And it doesn't really matter how we get there as long as we do. So it really depends on the context. In some cases, having those targets really helps. In other cases, what really matters is that investors put money on the table, the corporates actually put the revenue to buy the high quality removals, governments put the public funding that they need to. So however we can stimulate that, the better. I don't think there's a necessary answer as long as we get to the outcome of investing today and consistently for the next few decades.
Thank you, Noah. And I think this already brings us to the end of the panel. We have to start now. I think it's a good closure. But to actually close this panel, I would like to ask all panelists to share your views very briefly on what has been discussed here in the room. So the focus was on transatlantic dialogue. So what can the community here in the room actually do to start this transatlantic dialogue that is focused on getting projects off the ground and start now? Please be brief. And Ingrid, do you want to start?
Maybe I have my cop brain on, but I really want the room here, the community around CDR, to create similar to the methane pledge, create a CDR or carbon pledge with non-state actors and the state actors, hopefully across the transatlantic. That would be a dream come true for 2023, and I hope we manage to do that together. So the non-state actors in the room can push that forward as well.
Yeah, why don't we continue with Noah?
Just so happens that at the Major Economies Forum a few weeks ago, the Carbon Management Challenge was announced. So I think we have the seeds of a broader challenge to get that exact conversation happening, at least on a government-to-government level. But to answer your question, the dialogue is happening. And I think what we need to do is encourage folks to reach out. Our door is open. We want to be able to share what we are learning. We want to learn from others. And I think what's important is that we celebrate how far we've come. This conversation would not have been possible a few years ago, and recognize that at the same time, we all have to go so much further. It's not a contest, it's more of a group project, if you will, and so we're eager to continue that dialogue and support and look forward to leading the way forward with colleagues here in Europe and beyond.
Thank you. Fabienne?
No, I can only fully agree, and I think this kind of event with Nora coming in Europe to discuss with us, and it's very helpful, so thank you very much for this. And to have stakeholders that are involved in the discussion on both sides of the Atlantic is very useful. For instance, I was mentioning the expert group on carbon removal. We have experts from North America in this expert group that are participating to our discussion that we have in Europe, that are giving us their experience and sharing their views. And we should encourage this kind of discussion. We should also participate when possible, us from Europe, to the discussions that are taking place in international forum, of course, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on carbon removal, but also more bilateral discussions. So I think this is very useful.
Thank you, Fabienne. Florian?
Yeah, I like how Nora put it. I think it's a group project, and I think that's something that especially coming from a startup perspective, really acknowledging that the problems the industry has to solve as a whole are much bigger than the individual problems of the individual companies, right? So, coming together and really having a loud voice also towards policy, towards potential off-takers is really critical. So I guess having those forums for collaboration and really working together with NGOs like Carbon Gap, platforms like the Negative Emissions Platform, and really like bundling everyone's voice to create a policy framework that will help the industry industry scale up is super critical. So I think collaboration is key.
Yeah, trying to add what already has not been said. So I think the policy frameworks are quite different. So there might be a bit harder to find common ground and the exact learnings that you can transfer. But I think comparing notes and finding specific areas of collaboration between US and Europe, I mean, the obvious candidate where to focus would be innovation, especially the way Noah described all the work that's happening in the US. Because whilst the policy frameworks are different, building facilities looks the same on both sides of Atlantic. So sharing the learnings and the innovation and what that could lead to could be super helpful to scale removals.
Perfect. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was super interesting, and I would encourage to continue the discussion. We just heard we also need other actors involved. We need civil society, NGOs, and so on involved. Companies, we have many of them in the room today. So let's continue the discussion, and thank you very much again.